Hello, everybody. This is Tosca at NGOs Soul and Strategy. Today, I'm going to interview two women who've written a really interesting book, a very important book that's coming out next month in March 2022. And the book is about smart tech. We're going to explain it and talk about it. First, a little bit about the authors, but let me first welcome you. Allison and Beth Kanter, welcome.
Thank you for having us, Tosca.
Great to be here, Tosca.
Absolutely. I'm thrilled to have you here because you have expertise about something that is very important, yet not necessarily a body of knowledge that is very widely understood, and certainly also not a body of knowledge that I have much of. So first, I want to explain a little bit to how Allison and Beth and I happen to be all part of a network called Leap of Reason Ambassadors. That's an invitation-based network of nonprofits, focused people who really care about promoting an outcome or performance orientation amongst nonprofits. I've also known Beth's expertise in facilitation for several years, including her expertise on virtual facilitation. And I know of Allison's writing on a couple of books that I will mention at the end, and that we will also put in the in the show notes, as well as Beth's book. So we're talking about two extremely accomplished women authors here. I should say upfront, when we talk about smart tech, I have not much exposure myself to digital or smart tech in general, other than that I do have an interest in digital adaptation and transformation of NGOs, but not a lot of knowledge about it, just an interest. And I'm particularly interested in what is required in terms of digital literacy by leaders. I've done some research in the past on digital campaigning platforms and how they compare contrast with brick and mortar NGOs. And I was on the board of Public Interest Registry, which is the wholesale operator for the internet domain name.org that 10.5 million nonprofits across the world uses their trusted domain. So I have these little bits of kind of initial exposure, but I have really no idea about the topic that you wrote about. So I'm very excited. The book that Allison and Beth have written is called The Smart Nonprofit, Staying Human-Centered in an Automated World. And so let me just finish the introduction by saying that when Allison and Beth talk about smart tech, they use it as an umbrella term for advanced digital technologies that make decisions for people instead of people making those decisions. So let's unpack it a little bit. So Beth and Allison, tell us first a little bit about why the two of you decided to work together on smart tech. How does this topic link into your respective areas of expertise?
Allison and I have been working together we're going into our second decade, and Allison will find this funny. I said, we've been working together for decades. That was yesterday. And I guess it's because of the pandemic, it feels like decades, but for a good amount of time, we wrote our first book together, The Network Nonprofit, over 12, 13 years ago. And that was about how online social networks were going to change the way that nonprofits would do their work. And so I could say for myself, I won't speak for Allison, but my work has always sort of been at the intersection of emerging technology and nonprofit work, and I've approached it as a trainer, and looking and sort of helping nonprofits understand the benefits and the challenges of particular technologies as they adopt them.
I see. Allison, you want to add more to that?
Sure. When we looked at the 10-year anniversary of the Network Nonprofit, Tosca, we wanted to look forward instead of looking back. And the question we asked ourselves is, what's next? And what's next is smart tech. And we had the great opportunity to work with the Gates Foundation to look at the impact of smart tech on fundraising. And we wrote a paper about that called AI for Giving that came out about, I guess, 2 years ago. And that led to the book, because our work, Tosca, is always about where are we going from here, and how can Beth and I help organizations, particularly leaders of organizations, prepare to use technology for great impact for social change.
Interesting.
Another way to think about this, Tosca, is we also wanted to answer the question: what can we do with smart tech before the robots kill us? So we want to get our hands around this.
Got it. But it's really, yeah, I get it completely. So you had written this important book on the network nonprofit. Again, we'll put the links in the show note. But you said, what's next? And this is, you're right. The little I understand so far, and the more, and you're going to educate us about this, that makes total sense. Yeah. So what would you say, maybe starting with Beth, what were the main arguments that you make in the book?
Well, the reason we wanted to write this book, and this is not a technical tome at all, it's really directed towards leaders. And this technology, as you pointed out in your introduction, is different than social media. You know, it's something we can't see. It's not visible. It's not like the refrigerator humming in the background. And it's impacting all aspects of our lives, from what movies we're going to watch on TV to what we might purchase on Amazon. And now, as the technology has gotten, there's more computing power, and the technology has gotten cheaper, it's become more available to nonprofits and everyday people for their work. And one of the great values or benefits of adopting this technology is the automation aspect. It can kill the grunt work from organizations that just takes up so much time and is so exhausting, especially, you know, during the pandemic, and it can eliminate that. And if we think about it, we have this once in a lifetime moment to really think about, how do we remake our work as nonprofits? You know, we have time now. Maybe if we get rid of that grunt work, we have time to think, we have time to innovate internally, we have time to give staff that rest that they so need. And also, and Allison likes to talk about this piece of it, what can happen externally with relationships with clients and donors, and pass it to Allison.
So Tosca, we're looking at a 30 or 40-year arc of all sorts of technologies for the last 15 years, certainly digital technology, that made organizations go faster and faster. And the internal pressure that created, that you know, staff felt to be more and more efficient, is part of the Great Resignation right now, right? That idea that people are running on the hamster wheel every day. We just saw a data point that people check their emails 74 times a day, Tosca, right? This game of email whack-a-mole is crazy making.
Yes.
And in the NGO world, what this looks like is constantly running from campaign to campaign, going as fast as you can, not looking at impact, and not having a chance to breathe. And the result is that the cultures of our organizations are incredibly transactional. It is exhausting for staff. We have very high rates of burnout. And ultimately, staff don't get to do the work they came to do, right? Our people, we hire people, right?
Yes.
We hire people who want to be in relation with other people. We need
We
to
make them cut and paste spreadsheets from one to
all
the
day
other,
long,
all day long.
So what we think the greatest opportunity here is to pivot from being transactional to being relational, and to have the time that Beth mentioned, when you can get rid of the rote work, this time that we call the dividend of time, to spend on relationship building and storytelling and problem solving and network building.
Can we, can you mention a couple of examples, concrete examples, both from the US domestic scene, if you will, of nonprofits, but also from the international sector, and that also cross human service to long-term programming to
Right.
campaigning and advocacy of these manifestations of smart tech, so that it becomes more concrete for me and for the listeners.
I can jump in with one, and this is both probably international as well as domestic, because it's in the fundraising area, and all organizations have to do this,
Yeah.
whether they're here in the US or abroad. And so we looked at in the paper that Allison had mentioned that was sponsored by the Gates Foundation, we did a landscape analysis of how is automation and artificial intelligence, how is it impacting the fundraising and giving. And so one quick example is an application called Gravity, and it sits over the top of Salesforce, and it's a tool for major gift officers who spend a good portion of their time doing something called desk work, which means going through their database. Hopefully it's a large one. If it's a large organization, there's going to be a couple thousand, if not tens of thousands of potential larger donors, to figure out which one of these should I cultivate or spend my time on. We heard from major gift officers that they might spend around 20 or 25 hours of their week on that desk work task. And that is grunt work, right? So the app can actually analyze that data really fast and come up with a sort of predictive analysis of, this is the group of donors that you should focus your time on cultivating. Here are some details around them synthesized, because it can swim through all the unopened, unstructured notes that people make in databases that we get overloaded when we read. And so what that does is essentially, and the app can do this in like a few minutes versus 20 hours of work. So that frees up that 19 hours, right? Or 19 and a half hours for that development major gifts person to spend time with the donor.
Right.
Cultivating them and bringing in the gift. That's one example.
I see. Yeah.
We saw the pandemic accelerate the use of smart tech around the world, Tosca. So Doctors Without Borders were using online chatbots to provide information about COVID. We saw food banks in Boston substituting robots instead of volunteers to pack meals, particularly at Thanksgiving time. There was an example of Carnegie Mellon working with a school district in Pittsburgh to rearrange bus routes to bring meals that kids would be having who are in need would be having at school. Instead, the buses were bringing the meals to the kids, right? And they were using machine learning to rearrange the bus routes almost on the fly, in effect. So one upside of the pandemic was the acceleration of the use of all sorts of smart tech.
Another one that we also love to talk about, and it is international development, is the Refugee Organization. And this was a partnership with Stanford University and Maxar satellite data, which is actually now tracking Russia's movement into Ukraine. But they had a problem during the pandemic and even before with overcrowding of refugee camps. And it's very labor intensive to go on site into the camp to figure out like how to reconfigure it to hold more people, who and what should go where. And so they were able to use machine learning, satellite imagery of different camps and reconfigure the camp. So this saved time on the ground. And during the pandemic, it also, was a safety issue.
Got it. Yeah, that makes it a lot more concrete, because at first, when we read as lay people, when we read terms like automation or AI, machine learning, natural language processing, it's kind of, my eyes start to glaze over, right? But your examples make it real. And it was also useful that you immediately distinguished or said what distinguishes automation from social media. What are the fundamental differences? Do you want to say a little bit more about that before we move on?
Sure. You want to go back?
Yeah, I was going to tell the story of, well, first of all, automation is not digitization. There's a difference. Okay, so we think about how in some organizations, how we get paid. Some get a check, right? You have to walk to the bank, maybe put it into the ATM machine and you deposit it. Digitizing that process is having electronic bank transfer, right? But that's not necessarily automation. Maybe that's a low level form of it. But what we're talking about is where the technology is actually making decisions for you. And a couple months ago, my car was in the shop, so I had a rental that had smart tech on it. And this smart tech was different from my car in that when you backed up, I saw actually the camera showed me what was behind me. Yeah. And at one point, my trash cans I wasn't in danger of hitting them, but they were reflecting light off the camera. So instead of it like beeping a warning, it actually slammed on the brakes. So it was actually took that decision-making away from me, the human, to put my foot on the brake, and the system did it. So that's what we're talking about when we say automation.
And that means that the human judgment no longer plays a role, right? And that is one of your, we'll go there when we go to the very fundamental issue of bias in the use of AI. But that is an important point, I believe, when I read your introduction chapter, that you said it's the making decisions for humans instead of humans making the decision, right? That is an important distinction.
And that's why we wrote the book, Tosca, because we don't want the technology to be running all by itself, right? So our definition of a smart nonprofit is an organization that stays human-centered. We always want people in charge, and that is knowledgeable and facile with using smart tech, right? Because we know that the technology right now, just like self-driving cars aren't ready to go down the street. We need people, but we need people who understand how to make sure the technology is being used well and where and how to use it. We like to say smart tech is Tabasco sauce. It's not ketchup, right? A little bit goes really far. You want to use it sparingly. You want to use it strategically, and you want to use it ethically, which is an issue that, we will talk about in a second. All of this requires, Tosca, the C-suite to lean in instead of leaning out when they hear words like AI and automation and smart tech. We need people like you leaning in instead of leaning back. And that's why we wrote the book.
If I can just push back for a moment, and this is just an impromptu thought here, but human judgment, of course, has a lot of error too. It has a ton of bias, right? If you have a brain, you have a bias and so on. Or in fact, you have lots of biases. And so often we think that we first think about something, make a decision, and then act. But actually, human beings often act first, and then we kind of rationalize post facto why we made that move, that action, right? But still, what do you say to that? If people push back and say, well, human judgment is not that great either.
So what we would say is, first of all, there's this fallacy that technology doesn't have bias as a part of it. And smart tech absolutely has bias built in because people made the code. And then you needed enormous amounts of data to train a system to look for patterns, because that's what AI does. And those data sets are biased as well, particularly in human services area, right? So not only do humans come with all of their biases, the technology does as well.
So it's what we want.
What we want to do is to make sure that we are doing our best to create a balance between humans and between technology, and we're getting the best out of both, Tosca, right? We are getting people's empathy. We're getting their experience, their knowledge, their concerns, and we're getting the regularity of the technology, right? The technology is not going to make an adding error. And what we're looking for is that sweet spot between both that others call co-botting as well. And that's what we're aiming for.
Co-botting, interesting.
And I would build on what Allison was saying. I would say that there's human judgment. Yes, I agree with you that there's flaws around that, and there's human judgment embedded in the code and in the algorithms, and that's where the bias can come from if you don't understand what are the assumptions behind the algorithm that's triggering the decisions? And then there can be bias in the data. It could be incomplete data. It could be a historical set of data that already had bias in it. When we think about like mortgages and redlining, that sort of thing. So there's that, but then there is a set of technology, we called it natural language processing, that can learn learn by interacting. Frequently, this is used behind chatbots.
Okay.
It's a more advanced form of automation where it actually learns from being socialized. So when people interact with it, it will then learn how to answer questions. And one example of where this can go awry, it happened a while back with Microsoft, and they put a bot named Tay on Twitter. And all of a sudden, the intent of it was to learn how to converse with young people. But the Twitter trolls got a hold of it, and within less than 24 hours turned it into a misogynist, racist, horrible, insulting bot, and they had to take it down.
Wow.
So that's where you can't just with especially the more sophisticated technology just let it go. We need to really pull back and be human-centered. And I always show another example as the sort of counterpoint to that, and that comes from the Trevor Project, which is a teens in crisis, LGBTQ teens in crisis, and they are using a bot not to be on the front lines, because that could be very dangerous, interacting with a teen in crisis. And also their counseling is very human oriented and empathetic. And there's a lot of rigorous training that goes into training these counselors. So what they used the bot for is to simulate interactions to train more counselors. And the bot it's one of these advanced ones. It only interacts in controlled environments.
I see.
Not with the general public.
I see. Yeah. Well, since we went into the topic of bias and AI generated data, and again, I was struck in your introductory chapter when you quote the data scientist Cathy O'Neill, who says, algorithms are opinions embedded in code, right?
That's right.
That's a really powerful, powerful saying. So tell us a little bit more still about in what areas of nonprofit work can this kind of inbuilt bias, because it's primarily white males who have been doing the coding of the initial system. In what areas of nonprofit work can it have the most profound negative impacts? And what can nonprofits do who themselves are not digital coders themselves? What can they do to protect themselves from choosing sets of data and code systems that have already that bias built in?
Beth, why don't I start with the areas in the org, and then you can go to readiness in doing this. So I think two places in particular, Tosca, jump out at me as the places where bias and smart tech can have profound negative impacts on organizations. One is in hiring. More and more organizations are using a screening software to look at incoming resumes. Almost everyone, whenever someone says to me they're using it, like, oh, but don't worry, we have people, looking at them. What they're not necessarily looking at or understanding is who got screened out from these systems. Because the systems themselves are looking for certain patterns in resumes and language that can often weed out or be unwelcoming to people of color, to women.
Yeah.
So that's one area where you may not even know who got screened out.
Can I stop you there, Allison, for one moment? Can I just probe on one thing? So if we know, especially if we think about the last couple of years, a lot of attention is being paid in the context of diversity, equity, inclusion around not to be asking for certain kinds of degrees or degrees from certain schools, colleges, etc., but to be looking for experiences, to be looking for proof of competency rather than certification of one kind or the other, or internships, whatever, right? Are you saying that this kind of bias will further make those applicants in a recruitment process be weeded out, because the automated process will automatically go to those kind of markers?
So it totally and entirely depends, Tosca, on what the system is set to look for, right? And all sorts of different systems have all sorts of different filters. So it can be set to be, sensitive to the kinds of markers that you mentioned. The more worrying part for me in this regard is, and we're back to transactional cultures, organizations are so pressed to go quickly. When the opportunity is there to automate a system to screen resumes, people will just let it go, right? And from our opening chapter, how likely people are to allow automated systems to make decisions for you without asking the right questions. And Beth is, an expert in helping to set the stage for those questions. So hiring is one area. The other area are organizations increasingly using smart tech to screen people for services. And this has been going on for a while. Governments are doing this. NGOs are doing it as well. But again, you're overwhelmed with the demand for services. Super easy to grab software off the shelf that is, quote, smart and has AI built into it. And what you may not know is that AI is now approving more, say, white people for homeless services, like in our opening story in the book, than people of color, right? And the system has been set up to do that kind of screening, which is why being really strategic and asking the right questions on the front end is critically important to the good use of smart tech.
Okay. Well, maybe let me move to Beth and the topic of digital literacy of leaders, right? And I'm struggling here with the light on my end is fading, but so you said in the opening chapter, you say making strategic decisions about when and how to use smart tech is a leadership challenge, not a technical problem. And I, again, was struck by that because I know that outside the area of smart tech, but more broadly, when it comes to digital and digital transformation and adaptation, that often the knee-jerk reaction of leaders may be, okay, we'll just ask our CTO, our chief of technical operations, right, to give us the input on that. So what should be the digital literacy, if you will, of senior leadership teams to not leave it to the CTO, the chief technical officer, but to really take responsibility themselves as a team for making smart decisions about smart tech?
Great question, Tosca. So the first thing that I will say is they don't need to know how to code. Right.
Good.
So they don't need to put their hands on code. They don't need to even know math, if that math's not their thing. Some leaders know math, and that's great. But it's real, and not to initially jump to these questions such as, how can we use a chatbot? Or how can we use, this automated CRM,
that they've heard about.
Right. The real question is, what is the problem that we're trying to solve for? What is the pain point that we want to address? And and are we being human-centered around addressing it? And so that's like the ready part of our framework that we have in the book called Ready, Set, Go. And it's kind of identifying the problem. And then not just identifying it with the senior leadership team, maybe in collaboration with the tech people sitting around the conference room, or maybe sitting on a Zoom call these days, but to go out and do maybe a little bit of ethnographic research, interview some of those stakeholders, interview some of those clients. Yes. And I know a lot of the international development community is probably a little bit further ahead than other NGOs and applying design thinking methods, but this is a real opportunity to step back and really think about it from the end user's point of view. And while you're there, also thinking about taking a do no harm pledge. So by us solving this problem with this particular use case, are we creating another problem for the end user? So that's all of the readiness stuff. The set piece is, this is where we start to dig into the tools, not just grab them off the shelf, but really explore them, understand them, ask hard questions, push back on the vendors. Can you tell us, what assumptions has your algorithm been created? What is the data set that your tool has been trained on? And really understand where there may be some flaws with that.
And your book is offering those kind of concrete questions.
Yes, and a whole kind of pathway.
Cheat sheet.
Yes, absolutely. What questions you should be asking, the kinds of sessions you may be convening, and it's go slow because we don't have much time, right? You don't want to run into doing something that could scale something bad happening, and we have examples of that in the book, or even just taking the example from Microsoft that we talked about earlier. Yeah. And then once you've done a lot of this readiness work, it's then beginning with a pilot, a proof of concept, seeing how it works, because sometimes we can't anticipate all the potential bad things that could happen. Totally. So we need to do it on a small level, work out some of those ideas, and maybe we've discovered that this isn't the right use case and we need to kind of reconfigure. And then it's about really testing and iterating and then getting to scale. And once we're at scale, it's this technology is not like a pot roast. We don't set it and forget it. It needs ongoing fine tuning and care, because it's always learning and changing.
I see. And Allison, in that chapter 2, there is a subheading that I noticed, leading through resistance.
Yes.
Tell us more about what you write about there.
So, well, Tosca, the resistance to change in organizations, the resistance to tech within organizations, and this smart tech is hitting both of those, raw nerves at the same time. And so what people who are introducing smart tech into organizations, the resistance that they'll find is the outmoded idea that technology can't be smart, the outmoded idea that only people can do large parts of this work, or that we won't be able to see the results of automation. And what we know right now is the technology has become a whole lot smarter just in the last couple of years, as well as inexpensive, which is why we're having this conversation today. It is commercially available to organizations. And the idea about cobotting that we discussed just a few minutes ago, which is proactively ensuring that the technology is balanced with people. And as Beth so cogently mentioned, right, that is a leadership challenge. So often in organizations, when you're sitting with the C-suite or in the boardroom, you'll just see people put up their guard, just an absolute no, and not really lean into learning more about these topics and understanding what the benefit is to organizations of trying to clear out some of that crazy making rote work and allow staff to do more creative work.
Interesting. I do have
it's fear-based and it's scarcity-based, Tosca, that kind of leadership resistance. And that's what we're really working hard to try to overcome.
Yeah, because while your book, from what I can gauge from the introductory chapter, definitely sounds not the alarm bell, but sounds an alert bell, if you will, around what are some of the advantages, but also disadvantages of smart tech. I didn't think about it exactly that way. So looking at, we have a couple more minutes left. So your book has a chapter at the end, logically, about the future of nonprofits and how they should engage with smart tech. And so you introduce these 3 concepts. You've mentioned already being human-centered, being prepared, and being knowledgeable and reflective. Now, of course, taking the time and having the patience to reflect are not things that are necessarily widely available in our sector. But maybe we can end on you, maybe starting with Beth, unpacking that a little bit more. Where realistically, where you see nonprofits interact most beneficially with smart tech, make use of it where it's useful, and be really careful around where it's potentially very dangerous.
One example, I'm going to do two. I have one example I already talked about. It's my favorite one, the Trevor Project, and the idea that they didn't just say, "Oh, we're going to replace the counselors with the bots," but they really took the time to understand what what is the human-centered way to approach this. Another organization that works with animal welfare decided, and again, it was a bot, decided that they wanted to use one of these self-learning bots for Black Cat Adoption Week, because Black cats are considered unlucky and they're hard to adopt. And if you can imagine the words Black and cat and self-learning with a public-facing campaign, you can imagine that can be all kinds of problems. And they tried to mitigate potential problems, but it ended up taking so much time, and they sort of weighed off the risks and said, this is probably not the best use case. But they were willing to actually test out a pilot concept of it, even with going into that knowing that, wow, this might totally fail, but that's okay because we're learning from this, so we can pivot to something that may be more effective.
I see. And Allison, maybe there was one thing that I just thought about that. So you mentioned some of the advantages if nonprofits work well with smart tech, and one of the advantages is reduced astroturfing. Now, again, I'm cognizant of the fact that I'm not a native speaker, and many of my audience are not native English speakers. So you're explaining that advocacy organizations too often substitute marketing for real grassroots organizing. So instead of using online petitions that are fairly superficial, if you will, form of campaigning, although groups like Avast might well push back on that. But anyway, you're saying advocates could use the dividend of time that you mentioned before to really engage with supporters, getting to know them, educating them on the issue, and teaching them how to become advocates and creating their own supporter groups. Tell us more in the book about that how this form of fairly superficial form of member engagement around campaigning can be transformed through a smart use of smart tech.
So we're back again to these transactional engagements that organizations have been having, and that frankly, social media, much to our dismay, because Beth and I both started out as what we call techtopians. We were so excited 15 years ago. But the reality is that too many organizations continue to use social media as a one-way broadcast tool, right?
Yes.
Right. And anything that is intake, like a survey tool, is often largely used to collect email addresses. Right. That's not real human relationship building engagement.
And
that's
it's not long-term organizing either.
Right. So again, if we can free ourselves up to then pivot to relational models internally as well as externally, we have the opportunity to really build relationships in community, both online and on land. And to get to know people. For instance, Tosca, I would love to see every organization go back to donors after they've given, especially in the first year before they fall off, and ask them why this cause is so important to them. What is it about this cause that strikes your heart, which is why we give, and why is it important to you? And to have those real meaningful conversations with people. In the absence of that, the model that we have now, this transactional model, we have what Beth and I call the leaky bucket problem in fundraising, which is 75% of donors don't give a second time. 75%, right? So if we can be a little less frantic, if we can get our heads up out of the weeds, we hope there is the opportunity for organizations to really think about truly engaging with people, learning with them, getting to know them, and building really strong campaigns with them.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, it's a clear case. Well, by now, I think, yes, looking at the time, we better bring this interview to a close. And by now I'm staring straight into the sun that is going down outside my window. Beth and Allison, if people want to know more about you, want to find out about your upcoming book, we'll put the link to, it's coming out, on March 9th, I think, so very soon. But if they want to know in general more about your writing, your practice, your consulting, your activism, where should they go?
You can, the best place to find me is at my website, and that's www.bethkanter.org. And from there, you can find all my social presence, my blog, and links to, and a link to the book, prominently displayed.
Okay, sounds good. And how about you, Allison?
I'm at AllisonFine.com.
AllisonFine.com, both also your website. Well, it's been fascinating. We've barely dipped into what is a very deep topic, very new in terms of broad awareness, I think, to many of our nonprofit and NGO leaders and managers and staff that are listening. So I really want to thank you for giving us a very, and I don't mean this kind of in a pun intended way, but an intelligent way of looking at smart tech, that type of technology that actually makes decisions for people. So we better make sure that we are intelligent about how we choose those forms of tech in our nonprofits' lives. So thank you, Beth and Allison, for all your insights, and thank you, listeners. If you found this podcast stimulating, then I hope you'll check out the other episodes of my podcast on my website, 5oaksconsulting.org, where you'll find also offerings around courses on virtual team leadership, blog posts, etc. Subscribe to my email list and you will always be the first to know. So with that, this is Tosca, and I look forward to spending time with you on NGO Soul and Strategy next time.